I came home from burying my sister to find a stranger rearranging my kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to me, pulling open cabinet doors one by one and peering inside like she was taking inventory. She had a legal pad tucked under one arm and a tape measure clipped to her belt. She hadn't heard me come in. For a moment, I just stood there in the doorway with my overnight bag still in my hand and my black dress still on from the graveside service, and I watched her open the cabinet above the stove, the one where I've kept my cast iron skillet for 31 years. Then she turned around. She was younger than I'd expected. 30-something, polished, the kind of woman who wore a silk blouse on a Tuesday afternoon like it cost her no effort. She didn't look alarmed when she saw me. She looked inconvenienced. "You must be Doris," she said. Not a question, not an apology. Just a statement, the way you'd acknowledge a piece of furniture that had been set in an awkward spot. "I must be," I said, "and this is my house." She set her legal pad down on my counter. "Richard told me you'd probably come by this week. I'm Kristen. He asked me to start getting a sense of the space." I didn't respond right away. I thought about my sister Greta, whom I'd watched them lower into the ground 6 hours earlier in a cemetery outside of Greensboro. I'd driven the 2 hours back to Asheville because I'd promised Greta's daughter I would help with the family gathering, and I needed to change out of my mourning clothes. I looked at this woman standing in my kitchen with her tape measure and her legal pad, and I thought about 34 years of marriage, and I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I set my bag down, took my phone out, and called my attorney. If you've ever stood in a room that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, I want you to stay with me. You're going to want to see how this ends. My name is Doris Pemberton. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my adult life I was the kind of woman who moved quietly through the world, keeping things orderly and steady and warm. I spent 28 years as the head librarian at an elementary school in Asheville, North Carolina. I knew every child's reading level, every teacher's preferred schedule for quiet hours, every parent who needed a gentle nudge to get their child signed up for the summer reading program. I was good at reading rooms long before I understood that my own home was the room I'd stopped reading correctly. I married Richard Pemberton when I was 29. He was finishing his law degree, and we were two people with big plans and almost no money, renting a duplex off Marymount Avenue with a broken dishwasher and a landlord who never called back. Those early years were hard in the specific way hopeful things are hard. You're exhausted all the time, but the exhaustion doesn't feel like suffering because you're building something together. I managed our household budget down to the dollar. I worked full-time while Richard studied for the bar. When he passed on his second attempt, I bought a bottle of champagne we couldn't really afford and toasted him across a kitchen table that wobbled on one leg. When he opened his first office, a small suite in a building on Charlotte Street, I helped him move boxes, set up the filing system, and organize his first open house for prospective clients. Our daughter Stephanie was born the following year. Our son Bradley, 2 years after that. For a long time, we were genuinely a team. I want to say that clearly, not because it excuses anything that came later, but because it explains why the unraveling was so hard to see. When things shift inside a relationship you've trusted for decades, you stop looking for the change. You assume, you extend the same goodwill you've always extended, because that's what love looks like from the inside of it. Until the day it doesn't. I couldn't give you an exact year when the air in the house changed. I can only tell you that at some point, Richard stopped including me in decisions, not dramatically, incrementally. Financial matters that used to be conversations became announcements. Dinner talk that used to be shared became his monologues about clients and negotiations, and when I tried to contribute, he'd give me the kind of smile you give someone when they've said something earnest but's beside the point. "You've always been a people person more than a numbers person," he told me once, and he meant it kindly. But what it actually meant was, "I've decided this isn't your department." I let it happen, not out of foolishness, out of trust and busyness and the deeply ingrained habit of smoothing things over rather than pushing back. You don't build a pattern like that overnight. You build it one small accommodation at a time until accommodation becomes simply who you are. The first sign I noticed was the phone. Richard had always been attached to his. It came with the work. But somewhere around 18 months ago, the quality of that attachment changed. He started keeping it face down on the table, left the room to take calls, came to bed later. On evenings, he said he was reviewing case files, but when I passed his study, I could see the pale light of a phone screen through the gap under the door, not the white lamp glow of someone working. I told myself I was reading too much into things. I'd had a lifetime of practice at that particular kind of self-dismissal. Then I found the text. I wasn't searching for anything. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the garage, and the screen lit up with a preview I couldn't have avoided even if I'd tried. The house on Garfield is everything you described. We could make this work. The contact listed just an initial K. I set a plate down on the counter carefully and stood very still for a long moment. Then Richard came back inside and I said nothing. I had become, over the years, very skilled at saying nothing. But from that point forward, I paid close attention, very close attention. He started coming home by a different route, adding 20 minutes to a commute that hadn't changed in 12 years. He bought new shoes. Not the practical ones he'd worn for as long as I could remember, but Italian leather that caught light differently when he walked across our hardwood floors. He lost weight without mentioning he was watching what he ate, and when I said he looked like he'd been taking care of himself, he smiled and changed the subject. The thing about observing someone carefully when they don't realize it is that you start noticing small things you'd overlooked for years. Not dramatic things. Subtle ones. The way he'd glance at his phone before walking through our front door, as if composing himself. The way questions about my day had quietly disappeared from his end of our dinner conversations, not out of rudeness, but because something else had moved into that space. And then Greta got sick. My sister had been fighting cancer for nearly 2 years by the time her doctors said the disease was moving faster than they could manage. She lived outside Greensboro, and I began making the drive every week, sometimes twice. Richard said all the right things. Family first. Go. Take the time you need. He said he'd manage dinner on his own. He said don't worry about things here. Looking back, I understand that my absence was useful to him. I don't say that easily. It's the kind of sentence that settles in your chest like something cold. But it's true, and I have made a commitment to myself, in the months since everything that happened, to say the true things plainly, even when they're hard to hold. It was my friend Glenda Morse who finally helped me see what I'd been looking at without fully recognizing. Glenda and I had known each other nearly 20 years. We'd met through a neighborhood group and discovered we both liked strong coffee, plain conversation, and the same mystery novelist. She'd spent her career in human resources management, which gave her a nearly clinical eye for the way people behaved when they thought no one was paying attention. I told her everything over coffee on a Thursday morning in early spring, about 6 weeks before Greta passed. The text message, the financial accounts I couldn't make sense of, a company that had appeared in our online banking, Pemberton Property Holdings LLC. That I had no memory of discussing or agreeing to. Glenda didn't react with shock. She got very quiet, the way she did when she was thinking carefully. Has Richard mentioned anything to you about a property on Garfield Road? She asked. I frowned. No, what property on Garfield Road? She turned her laptop toward me. She'd pulled up the Buncombe County Property Search database, and there it was. A residential property on Garfield Road in West Asheville, purchased 8 months earlier through Pemberton Property Holdings LLC. I stared at the screen for a long time. I never agreed to anything under that name, I said. I know, Glenda said, which is exactly why you need to talk to Ingrid Walsh. Ingrid Walsh had been practicing family law in Asheville for over 20 years. What I remember most from our first meeting is that she would not let me hedge. Every time I tried to soften what I was saying, maybe there was a reason I didn't know about. Maybe I'd misunderstood. She'd ask a precise question that brought me back to what I actually knew. "Your mother left you the cabin on Ridgeline Road," she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought her. "Yes. It's been in my family since 1962. She inherited it from her parents and structured it carefully when she passed. She had an estate attorney make sure the property came to me directly." Ingrid looked up briefly over her reading glasses. She was a careful woman. "She didn't entirely trust Richard with certain things," I said. Ingrid didn't react to that. She just continued reviewing. Then she slid a document across the desk. I looked at it for what felt like a very long time before the words arranged themselves into meaning. It was a deed transfer, the Ridgeline Road cabin, filed 7 weeks earlier with the County Register of Deeds. The property had been conveyed into Pemberton Property Holdings, LLC, with my signature on it. A signature I had never made. "He filed this while I was in Greensboro," I said slowly, "while Greta was still alive. I was there for 12 days straight." "The notary who witnessed the signature," Ingrid said, her voice careful and even, "is an employee of Richard's office." The room was quiet in a specific way that I won't forget. I could hear traffic outside. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed, and I could hear my own breathing, which had gone very still and shallow, the way it does when your body understands something your mind is still processing. "He needed the cabin as collateral," I said. "It wasn't a question. For the Garfield Road property, for whatever he's building with her." "That's what the financial records suggest," Ingrid said. "The LLC was structured to borrow against the Ridgeline cabin. It's the most valuable asset he had access to. No mortgage, clear title, or what he believed was clear title." "Because my mother paid it off before she died," I said. "Because my grandparents built it themselves." Ingrid let that sit for a moment. "The signature is fraudulent," she said. "That's not difficult to prove. The question is how we respond, carefully, completely, and before he realizes what we know." I drove home that evening in the dark and sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. Richard was in his study with the door mostly closed. I could hear his voice, low and warm and measured in the way it used to be when he talked to me. I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, sat at the table, and thought more clearly than I had in a very long time. Greta died on a Tuesday morning in May. We had her service on Friday. I drove down alone because Richard said he had a court appearance that couldn't be moved. I held my niece's hand at the graveside and did not fall apart, not because I wasn't grieving. I was, deeply, but because grief had been living in me long enough by then that I had learned how to carry it without being stopped by it. I drove back to Asheville on Saturday afternoon. I had told Richard I'd be home Sunday, but my niece had finished needing my help earlier than expected. I pulled into my driveway, walked through my front door, and found Kristen standing in my kitchen. Here is what I want you to understand about that moment. I was not surprised. I had been paying attention and preparing for long enough that when the truth finally stepped into the light, it felt almost like a release of pressure rather than a new blow. They thought I would dissolve. They had built their plans on the assumption that I would dissolve. I did not dissolve. I called Ingrid while Kristen was still standing at my counter. I set the phone down between us on speaker and said, "Ingrid, I think it's time." Ingrid's voice came through evenly and professionally. "This is Ingrid Walsh speaking. Who is present?" Kristen gave her name. She was working to reassemble the composure she'd walked in with, but there were gaps in it now, and they were widening. Ingrid didn't raise her voice once. She explained in clear, specific terms that the property Kristen was standing in belonged to me. She explained that the deed transfer of the Ridgeline Road cabin was fraudulent, supported by documentation, and that any financial instruments built against that fraudulent transfer were therefore invalid. She explained that any assessment or alteration activities currently being conducted without my consent exposed the individuals involved to civil liability. Kristen's legal pad was still on my counter. She picked it up and held it, without quite knowing what to do with it next. "Richard told me everything was handled," she said. Her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Richard told you quite a few things," Ingrid said, "that appear not to hold up." Bradley arrived 20 minutes later. He'd gotten a call from his father on the way over, I found out afterward. Richard, trying to reach the scene first, framed the situation before I could. My son walked in with his expression already set, the way people look when they've decided what they think before they've heard anything. "Dad said there's some kind of misunderstanding," he said, looking around the room. His eyes landed on Kristen, then on me. "What's going on?" "Ask your father why there's a woman in my kitchen taking measurements," I said. "She's his colleague. That's what he said." "She is the woman your father has been involved with for over a year," I said. I did not lower my voice or soften the words. I had spent too many years doing that. "She is here because your father told her this house was being transferred to him, and he wanted her to begin preparing it." Bradley looked at Kristen. "Is that?" "Richard said everything was settled legally," Kristen said, but the sentence had the sound of someone reading from a script they no longer believed in. "It isn't," Ingrid said from the phone. "Not even slightly." Bradley stood very still for a moment. I watched my son, 32 years old, a man I had raised and loved with everything I had, working through what he was seeing. He wanted to find a way to make it fit the version he'd arrived with. There wasn't one. Eventually, he sat down. Stephanie called me that evening. She had heard from Bradley, who had apparently sat in his car in my driveway for close to an hour after everything settled. My daughter was crying when I picked up, not out of grief exactly, but out of the particular fury that comes when someone you trusted makes a complete fool of you. "He did this while you were with Aunt Greta?" she said. "While she was dying, he was forging your name on a deed?" "Yes," I said. "Mom," her voice broke, "I'm so sorry I didn't." "You didn't know," I said. "He's been very careful about this for a very long time." She came over the next morning. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her the whole story, not the version I would have softened before all of this, but the real one. The text message, the LLC, Ingrid's findings, the notary who'd witnessed a signature for a woman she'd never met. Stephanie asked good questions and did not once try to find an explanation that would make her father look better. I appreciated that more than I had words for at the time. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go on a fence," I said. Ingrid filed the challenge to the deed transfer within the week. The evidence was not subtle. The notary had certified a signature during a period when I was documented to be more than 2 hours away in Greensboro. When Ingrid's team reached out, the notary did not attempt to deny what had happened. She said Richard had told her it was a procedural formality, that I had already given my agreement verbally, that the county just required something in writing. She had trusted him the way I had, the way Kristen had. The deed transfer was voided. The Ridgeline Road cabin was returned to my name without legal contest once the fraud was established. The financial instruments Richard had built against it collapsed accordingly. The Garfield Road property, purchased with borrowed leverage against something that was never his, became a problem he had to solve on his own. Kristen, I learned through a mutual acquaintance, had contributed her own money to preliminary renovation planning for a property she'd been told was already secured. She lost that money. I don't take satisfaction in that. She was deceived, and that's a harder thing to sit with than anger would be. Bradley called me 10 days after the confrontation. He sounded different, quieter, less certain, in a way I found genuinely hopeful. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Bradley, I walked into your house having already picked a side," he said, "before I heard one word from you. That wasn't right." "You believed what you were told," I said. "That's not a character failure. It's what happens when someone has been controlling information for a long time." There was a pause on his end. "Was he always like this?" he asked, "or did he change?" I thought about that question for a while before answering it. "Both," I said, and neither. People don't usually become unrecognizable overnight. They reveal more of what was already there over time when they feel safe enough to stop pretending. Bradley didn't say anything to that, but I could tell he was sitting with it. The divorce proceeding is underway. 34 years of shared finances is not a simple thing to untangle, and it has required patience and documentation and a great deal of time in Ingrid's office. But the foundation of what Richard tried to build on fraudulent paperwork has been fully dismantled, and there are additional legal questions stemming from the property scheme that he is now navigating through his own attorney in ways that are no longer my concern to manage. I am done managing things that are not my responsibility to manage. Last month, Stephanie drove up with her 2 daughters for a long weekend. We stayed at the Ridgeline cabin, the first time I'd been there since everything came to light. The girls ran through the rooms the way children run through spaces that feel old and safe, touching everything, investigating corners, calling out to each other across the hallway. Stephanie and I sat on the back porch with coffee in the morning while the light came through the trees in the way it's been coming through those trees for as long as I can remember. "You seem different," Stephanie said. "How so?" She thought for a moment, the way she does when she wants to get something right. "Like you stopped checking whether the floor was solid before you put your weight down," she said. "You're just standing on it." I looked out at the ridgeline and thought about what she'd said. She was right. That's exactly what it felt like. For years, I had been living at a lean, adjusting, softening, accommodating, making space. It's the kind of habit that settles into you so gradually, inside a marriage you trust, that you don't notice you've stopped standing upright. You wake up one day and realize you've been tilting for so long that tilting feels like balance. Now I stand straight. I still grieve what I thought my marriage was. That's honest, and I won't pretend otherwise. I grieve the version of Richard who toasted our future over a wobbly table in a drafty duplex on Marymount Avenue, the man I believed in completely during those early years when we had nothing, and it didn't feel like nothing because we were building towards something together. That man existed. That love was real. Its ending doesn't unmake what it once was. But real things end, and when they do, you choose what you become on the other side of it. I chose to stand in my own kitchen without checking whether I was allowed to be there. I chose to call the attorney while the woman was still in the room. I chose to tell my children the truth without softening it and to let them find their own footing from there. And I chose to stay in my house, not the cabin on Ridgeline Road alone, but the house on Whitfield Avenue where I raised my family, and the one my grandmother built in 1962, and every room in between. Because walking away would not have been freedom. It would have been surrender, dressed up to look like peace. There's one thing I want to leave with you, and I mean this not as a lesson from a distance, but as something I learned the hard way, and therefore hold carefully. Do not wait for the crisis to understand what belongs to you. Not just legally, although legally matters enormously, and I cannot overstate how grateful I am that my mother placed that cabin into a properly structured estate before she passed. But understand what belongs to you in the larger sense. Your history, your contribution. The decades of labor that went into building something real, even when no one was keeping score, and even when the story that got told afterward left your name out of it. Richard became, in the version of events he preferred, the man who built everything. He told that story so consistently that I half believed it myself toward the end. But he built it in a house I helped furnish, using a reputation I helped him maintain, while I managed our household and raised our children and drove to Greensboro twice a week to sit with my dying sister. He spent years quietly rewriting that history until my contribution had been compressed into the background of his story. He became the subject. I became the setting. Almost. The woman with the legal pad and the tape measure walked into my home, believing she was walking into someone else's beginning. She had been handed a version of reality that felt complete. A man who had handled everything, cleared every obstacle, secured the path forward. She believed him because he was convincing. He had been convincing for a very long time. But every room in my house knows me. The kitchen knows the sound of my cast iron skillet. The back hallway knows the particular weight of my step coming home after a long day. The cabin on Ridgeline Road knows the silence my grandmother kept on the back porch in the mornings, the same silence I keep now when I need to think. I walked through my front door that Saturday afternoon in my black funeral dress with my overnight bag in my hand, and I did not leave. I stayed and everything changed. I want you to know, if you're listening to this before the house wakes up, or on a long drive with the window partway down, or in the quiet after everyone else has gone to bed, I want you to know that it is never too late. Not at 50, not at 60, not after 3 decades of making yourself smaller so that someone else could take up more space. You are allowed to stop leaning. You are allowed to call the people who will tell you the truth and hand you the tools to use it. You are allowed to stand in every room you've earned. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if this story reached something in you, something you've been sitting with quietly for a long time, I want to hear about it in the comments below. Because you are not alone in this, you never were.